She didn't gasp. She didn't cry. She didn't even flinch. Eleanor Whitfield simply stood in the suffocating warmth of Lady Pemberton's card room, candle smoke thickening the air above the tables, and listened to a stranger reduce her entire existence to a single, bloodless sentence. Far too old to be anyone's bride now. He said it the way men discussed horses they had decided not to buy, not unkindly, which was, she would later think, the precise thing that made it so much worse than cruelty. Cruelty required noticing you. This man had not noticed her at all. She knew only two things about him in that moment: that his voice was low and unhurried, the voice of a man accustomed to delivering verdicts rather than seeking them, and that his companion, a sharper-faced gentleman she vaguely recognized as a Mr. Annesley, had followed the first man's glance toward her and not quite hidden his wince. 28, Eleanor thought, before she could stop herself. Not 25, 28, though she understood immediately that he hadn't meant it as a precise guess, only as a category, a bracket past which a woman ceased to be a prospect and became instead a fixture. She had imagined, once, that being told plainly she was unmarriageable would feel like a wound. It did not. It felt like an arithmetic problem someone else had finally bothered to solve out loud, in public, where she could not argue with the sum. But here is what you do not know yet, and neither did she. By the end of that same week, this man would be on his knee, and Eleanor Whitfield, spinster, household manager, keeper of ledgers and deferred repairs, would say yes, without having forgiven him, and without knowing the real reason he had asked. Eleanor. Her Aunt Constance's voice arrived at her elbow, low and urgent. Lady Constance Drummond had not heard the words, but she had spent 40 years learning to read faces at exactly such gatherings, and she had read her nieces in the half-second before Eleanor had composed it back to neutral. What's happened? Nothing, Eleanor said. I should like some air. She turned and discovered that her reticule had slipped its ribbon while she stood frozen. The small leather ledger she carried everywhere, her father's before it was hers, its spine soft with handling, fell to the floor and skidded toward a pair of polished boots. The boots belonged to the man who had just declared her obsolete. He bent for it before she could. He was tall enough that bending made him briefly, uncomfortably close, and when he straightened, he had already opened the cover, an old habit of curiosity, she would later learn, and found not pressed flowers, not a lady's romantic musings, but 2 columns of figures in a careful, unornamented hand. Candle wax. 4 shillings. Mrs. Pell's wages owed. Tenant cottage roof deferred again. He looked up. She watched him understand. From the stiffness of her shoulders, from the way Constance had gone very still beside her, exactly whose book this was, and exactly who had been standing close enough a minute earlier to hear every word he'd said. That is mine, Eleanor said, and held out her hand. He returned it at once. Forgive me, I didn't mean... He stopped. There was no good way to finish that sentence, and he seemed, for a man clearly unaccustomed to being at a loss, to know it. You didn't mean for me to hear you, Eleanor said. I understand. Most people who say true things about a person prefer the person not to be present for it. She inclined her head with exactly the degree of correctness the situation required. No more, no less. Good evening, she heard Annesley say quietly as she turned. Well, that went well, Aldemir. A duke, then? Of course. The terrace air was cooler than the room, and Eleanor stood at the balustrade doing nothing useful at all, only breathing, while London's lamplight smeared along the wet street below. "What did he say?" Constance demanded. Eleanor told her, not all of it. Some of the words refused to come out of her mouth a second time. But enough. Constance's expression went through several stages of outrage and arrived at something colder and more useful. 25, she said flatly. "He hasn't even troubled to guess correctly." "I don't think he was guessing my age precisely, Aunt. I think any number past 25 would have served his purpose equally well." "Which is worse," Constance said. "Not better." Below them, a door opened onto the street, and laughter spilled out with it. Henrietta's laughter, unmistakable, bright, unguarded, as Eleanor's younger sister emerged on the arm of some young gentleman, both of them flushed from dancing. Eleanor watched her for a moment, with the specific tenderness of someone watching a thing they have paid for and cannot regret the cost of. "She's enjoying herself," Constance observed. "She's meant to be." "And you," Constance said, with the sharpness she reserved for when she had decided to say the thing no one wanted said, "are meant to stand on terraces, being informed of your own obsolescence by peers of the realm. I do wonder, Eleanor, when it will occur to you that you are allowed to want something for yourself, in addition to wanting it for her." Eleanor didn't answer. She had an answer. She'd had it since her father died, and left 3 daughters, no dowries, and a household that did not run itself. But saying it aloud felt like admitting a defeat she preferred to keep private. "I should find Henrietta," she said instead. "It grows late." And here is the thing she did not allow herself to feel, standing on that terrace with her father's ledger pressed against her ribs. Relief. That she had not cried, that her voice had held, that she had walked away before he could see anything in her face that resembled caring what he thought. She would not examine, not then, why it mattered so much that he hadn't seen her care. He came the following morning. Not a card left at the door. Himself, in person, standing in the front room with Constance, and his hat, and an expression Eleanor would later describe to Henrietta as a man who has rehearsed an apology and discovered halfway through the door that it isn't sufficient. She had been at the small writing desk in the back parlor, the ledger open before her, attempting to make £4 behave like 6. Henrietta's new gloves had been a frivolous purchase, and Eleanor did not regret it, and also could not strictly afford it, and these two facts sat side by side in the same column without resolving each other. "His Grace the Duke of Aldemere," the card read, "has come himself." Eleanor closed the ledger out of habit, smoothed her skirt, and went to find out what a man said the morning after being caught at his own cruelty. He stood when she entered. He was younger looking than she had assumed from the depth of his voice. There was gray just beginning at his temple, the kind that came early to men who carried more than their years required. "I've come to apologize properly," he said, "not as I attempted last night, which I understand did not answer. It did not. I spoke carelessly. I had no right to discuss you in such terms, in any terms, to anyone." He stopped, reconsidered, chose a different sentence entirely. "I am sorry for it, entirely." Constance, seated near the window with her embroidery held up as a thin pretense of occupation, said nothing. From Constance, this was its own form of commentary. "Your apology is noted, Your Grace." Eleanor remained standing, which kept the visit shorter by unspoken agreement. Was there anything further? "I had hoped." Another pause. He was, she thought, like a man accustomed to delivering decisions rather than negotiating them, and finding the second skill considerably less developed than the first. I had hoped we might begin again as acquaintances. London is not so large a place that we shan't continue to meet, and I should prefer we did not do so as enemies. We are not enemies, Your Grace. Enemies generally think enough of one another to bear ill will. You and I had not met before last night. You formed an opinion of me from across a room, based on nothing, and were good enough to share it with a friend. She held his gaze. I don't require an apology so much as I require nothing further from you at all. That, I think, would suffice quite well. She watched the words land, a small tightening around his mouth. Not anger exactly, but the expression of a man recalibrating an estimate. That's fair, he said finally. More than fair. He picked up his hat, bowed correctly to each of them, and left. The door had not fully shut before Constance lowered her embroidery. He took that better than I expected, from a man who insults women for sport. I don't think he insults women for sport, Eleanor said, surprising herself with the fairness of it. I think he simply didn't think of me as a woman who might hear him, which is its own kind of insult, but a different one. Does the distinction comfort you? No, Eleanor admitted. Not particularly. But something had shifted, somewhere in the region of her arithmetic. She did not examine what. They met again 4 days later, at a recital neither of them had chosen, in any meaningful sense, to attend. It emerged, on arrival, when Eleanor found herself being seated beside the Duke, with the practiced inevitability of someone who has just realized the trap closed several minutes before she walked into the room, that Lady Constance and the Dowager Duchess of Aldemere had known each other for 30 years, and had conspired, in the specific manner of older women who enjoyed engineering things they would never admit to engineering, to share a box. Your mother and my aunt, Eleanor said, by way of greeting, appear to be friends. Old friends. He had the air of a man who had also only just discovered the implications. I had no notion until this morning that this extended to seating arrangements. Nor I. They sat through the first piece in the particular silence of two people determined not to make the situation worse by speaking. It was during the interval that the Dowager Duchess leaned across to ask Eleanor, with evident and unfeigned warmth, after her sister's progress this season. Eleanor found herself answering at greater length than she'd intended, because the Dowager listened the way few people in London bothered to. She is enjoying it very much, ma'am. I confess, I worried she would find town overwhelming, but she's taken to it better than I ever did. You did not enjoy your own season? He asked. It was the first thing he had said to her unprompted since they'd sat down. I had one season, Your Grace, 9 years ago. I spent most of it doing sums in my head to determine whether we could afford to stay in town past May. I don't recall enjoying it so much as surviving it creditably. And now? Now I do the same sums for Henrietta's season instead of my own, which I find considerably less stressful, since the outcome matters more and concerns me less personally. He looked at her for a moment, with an expression she couldn't immediately place. Not pity, which she would have refused, something closer to genuine interest, the look of a man encountering a fact that didn't fit his existing ledger of her. That's a very particular kind of selflessness, he said slowly. Or a very particular kind of evasion. Perhaps it's both. Eleanor did not elaborate, and the soprano returned before he could press further. She was glad of it. She told herself she was glad of it. But the shape she had assigned to his character, careless, uncurious, the author of a wound delivered without even the dignity of intention, complicated itself a week later, in the front hall of her aunt's Thursday gathering. A chandler arrived at the door, agitated, asking for the lady who sorts these matters. He had gone first to the Hartley's house 2 doors down, found it shut against him by a footman with firm instructions, and been directed, by a sympathetic housemaid, to Miss Whitfield at Lady Drummond's, who had, apparently, a reputation in the street for talking sense into people who owed money and people who were owed it alike. Eleanor stepped into the hall before her aunt's footman could turn him out for the impertinence of calling at all. "You're owed for the Hartley's candles," she said. "Not quite a question." "6 weeks, miss." "I've a family to feed, same as anyone. I'm told you might know how a man goes about it without losing his trade over the asking. I'm not the Hartleys, and I can't pay their debt for them. But I can tell you, Mrs. Hartley does her marketing on Tuesdays at the Burlington shops. I'd wager you'd have better luck presenting your account there, civilly in front of her acquaintance, than calling at a door that's already been shut on you twice. People settle accounts faster when there's an audience for the alternative. It costs you nothing to try it." The chandler considered this with the slow respect of a man unaccustomed to being given useful information instead of either money or excuses. That's good sense, miss. Thank you." "Don't thank me. Thank Tuesday." She turned back toward the drawing room and found Julian standing just inside the doorway. He had witnessed the entire exchange, and his expression was something she had genuinely not seen on him before. Unguarded, faintly startled, as though he'd walked into a room expecting one kind of furniture and found an entirely different kind. "You handled that," he said, "like a man of business." "I handled it like someone who has spent 18 months learning that most disputes about money are really disputes about being ignored. He didn't want a guinea from me. He wanted to stop being invisible, give a man a strategy instead of a sermon, and he generally goes away satisfied. I have a steward who could learn from you." "Your steward," she said, with the faintest edge, "presumably has a salary for the privilege of learning it himself." He laughed, a real laugh, short and startled out of him. And she realized she had not, in their previous encounters, heard him laugh at all. It changed his face considerably, made him look less like a duke and more like a man roughly her own age, who had simply forgotten, for a moment, to be careful. She filed this away without examining why she'd noticed it. She returned the favor of being startled 3 days later in Hyde Park. She saw him before he saw her, on foot, not on horseback, walking with a man she didn't recognize, an older fellow in plain but decent clothes, clearly not of his circle. They stopped near a bench. Julian said something low. The older man shook his head, protesting. Julian pressed something into the man's hand regardless. Folded paper, she couldn't see what, and the older man's protest died into something that looked, even from this distance, like the particular stillness of a person receiving more relief than pride could comfortably accept. Eleanor did not approach. She watched instead from beneath the brim of her bonnet until the older man walked on, and Julian remained a moment alone, looking after him. Then he noticed her. Miss Whitfield. He looked, for a half-second, like a man caught at something, which interested her more than it should have. "Was that one of your tenants?" A pause. "Former tenant, from Aldermere. He came to town hoping for work, and found none." He said it carefully, the way a man chose words to disclose exactly as much as he intended, and no more. "It's a small thing," he added. It didn't look like a small thing to him. "No," he admitted. "Perhaps not." He fell into step beside her, an easy, unannounced thing, and her maid adjusted her pace behind them without comment. "May I ask you something?" he said, "and trust you to answer honestly rather than correctly?" I generally prefer honestly. It requires less arithmetic. Do you think less of me still, for what I said that first evening? She considered it the way she gave consideration to a column that didn't balance, turning it over, for the error rather than simply restating the sum. I think you said an unkind thing, without knowing it was about a person who could hear it, she said at last, which is a flaw of carelessness rather than cruelty. I also think a man who can be careless in a ballroom and quietly generous in an empty corner of a park within the same fortnight is not entirely the man I assumed from the ballroom alone. She glanced at him. I withhold final judgment, Your Grace. First impressions are rarely worth the confidence people place in them. That, he said, is either the kindest or the most damning thing anyone has said to me this season, and I genuinely cannot tell which. Perhaps, she said, it's both. And when he laughed this time, she found she didn't mind it nearly as much as she'd expected to. Now, stop here for just a moment. Because you might be thinking, she's softening, he's charming her. This is where the story goes easy. It doesn't. What happens next is the thing that almost ends it entirely. The ball at Aldemere House was the first Julian had given since his father's death, a fact that carried its own weight among the guests, who arrived equal parts curious about the rooms and curious about the man who had inherited them. Eleanor had not meant to wander from the ballroom. She had meant only to find a window with air in it, away from the crush, for the space of one dance she didn't wish to sit out by, looking as though she minded sitting it out. But the corridor she chose led past an open door, and the open door led to a small library, dim and blessedly quiet, and on the desk within it sat a steward's ledger, open, abandoned mid-entry, lit by a single branch of candles. She should not have looked. She looked anyway. The particular weakness of a mind trained for 18 months to find numbers and worry at them like a loose thread, and she found within 30 seconds an error, a column of tenant rents that didn't sum correctly against the total carried forward. A difference of £11 vanished into bad arithmetic rather than bad faith. She had a pencil in her reticule. She always had a pencil. She had settled into the chair behind the desk to correct the figure, a low-backed chair set well into the room's shadow, the candle's light falling mostly across the desk's far edge, and was reaching to close the book when she heard voices in the corridor. Close, unhurried, and recognized one of them before either speaker appeared. Neither man glanced fully into the room. Men in earnest conversation rarely look anywhere but at each other. The library, from where they stood, would have read as empty and dim. And I tell you, Robert, I've made my decision, Miss Whitfield. I mean to propose. Eleanor went very still in the shadowed chair. Because you esteem her, Annesley said, with an edge suggesting this was not the first time tonight he'd tried this conversation. Or because you've convinced yourself it solves something it doesn't actually solve. Because she understands an estate ledger better than half the men I employ to manage mine. Because she handled a tradesman's dispute at her aunt's with more sense than my own steward shows in a month. Because she would never embarrass me, never overspend, never require management herself. She'd be running the house within a fortnight better than it's been run in a decade. His voice had gathered pace, the cadence of a man listing proofs rather than feelings. Eleanor recognized it, sitting alone in the dark with a corrected ledger still open before her, because it was precisely the cadence she used herself when justifying a difficult decision by stacking reasons until they outweighed the doubt. And does it occur to you, Annesley said, quieter now, that you are describing a steward, Aldemere, not a wife? Silence. It occurs to me, Julian said finally, that I would rather have her managing my house and my life than any woman in London with £30,000 and nothing else to recommend her. I don't know what to call that if not sense. Footsteps receding, the corridor emptying, and Eleanor remained where she was for a long moment, the corrected ledger still before her, £11 restored to a column that hadn't asked her to fix it. She had heard almost word for word the same sentence structure that had begun this entire acquaintance, a list of her usefulness, her competence, her suitability for managing a house rather than gracing one, only now delivered with respect instead of dismissal, which she discovered, sitting alone in a stranger's library with her own pencil still in her hand, did not feel like an improvement. It felt like a more elegant repetition of the original wound. She found him 20 minutes later near the terrace doors. "I heard you," she said, without preamble. "In the corridor with Mr. Ansley. I wasn't listening on purpose at first. I was in the library, in the chair where you didn't see me. But I didn't make myself known once I understood what was being said, and I think you should know that. So we may at least begin honestly." He went very still. "You said I would manage your house better than it's been managed in a decade. You said I would never embarrass you, never overspend, never require managing myself." Her voice held, barely. "You said all of that the way a man describes a transaction he's satisfied with." She looked at him directly. "I should like to ask you something, and I should like an honest answer rather than a correct one, since I find I no longer entirely trust the difference where you're concerned. Have you, at any point since that first evening, thought of me as anything other than a sum that happens to balance?" He opened his mouth. Whatever answer he had, and she watched him search for one, watched the particular helplessness of a man who had built an entirely reasonable case and discovered too late that reasonable was not the same as true, did not arrive in time. "I thought not," she said quietly. No triumph in it, only the flat exhaustion of having confirmed something she'd half expected from the very first night. "Good evening, Your Grace. Please give my compliments to the Dowager Duchess. It was a lovely ball." She left before the next dance began. He did not sleep. He spent most of the night in his study, the steward's ledger open before him, the corrected column in the margin staring back at him in a hand he now recognized instantly. Small, neat, unhesitating. She had been there, in the dark, fixing a stranger's arithmetic, not because anyone asked, not because there was a single thing in it for her, but because an error was an error and she had a pencil. He had stood in that corridor and built his case like a man arguing before magistrates. And he had won the argument. And winning it had cost him the one thing he hadn't accounted for in any column: her good opinion. He called at the Whitfield house at the earliest hour propriety allowed. Henrietta appeared in the hallway, twisting her hands. "My sister isn't receiving visitors this morning, Your Grace. Will she receive me this afternoon?" "I don't know that she'll receive you at all, sir." She said it with genuine apology, not malice. She's not been herself since the ball. She sat up half the night with the lamp lit. I heard her. He left his card and walked the long way back through streets just beginning to wake, and found that the walking did nothing whatsoever to settle the particular unease that had taken up residence in his chest since the terrace. He did not see her that day, nor the day after. On the third morning, enough time, he understood later, for a woman like Eleanor to have decided something, rather than merely reacted to something. He found her in Hyde Park, the early hour holding its particular hush. Her maid, trailing the customary discreet distance, both of them walking at a pace that suggested Eleanor had set out to tire herself into calm rather than to enjoy the morning. Miss Whitfield. She did not stop walking, but her maid slowed and fell back further. The particular discretion of a servant who had clearly been told at some point in the last 2 days that this gentleman was not to be treated as a stranger if he appeared. "I find I haven't the appetite for this conversation," Eleanor said. "Then permit me to have it without you needing to say anything at all. Walk if you like. I'll talk regardless." She slowed, which was not the same as stopping, but it was enough. "I built a case the night of the ball," he said. "The way I build every case, I don't want to examine too closely. I listed reasons: your competence, your steadiness, the fact that you would never embarrass me, would never need managing. Every one of those things is true. None of them is why." She glanced at him. "Then why, Your Grace?" "Because, since the night your ledger fell open in my hands, I have not been able to stop thinking about you, and that frightened me, considerably more than my debts do." A pause. "My father never once let a person matter more to him than a column of figures. Not my mother, not his tenants. Not, in the end, me. I built my entire understanding of myself around not becoming that man. And then I found myself doing exactly what he would have done, except worse, because I did it to you specifically. I dressed wanting you in the language of needing you, because needing was safer to admit to than wanting." He stopped walking. "I am sorry. Not for an apology's sake. Because it was a lie, and you deserved better than a lie delivered as flattery." Eleanor had stopped too, without deciding to. The path was quiet around them, an early nursemaid some distance off. Her maid a discreet shape near a stand of plane trees, conspicuously occupied with adjusting her bonnet ribbon. "I agreed with the first thing you said about me," Eleanor said at last. Her voice was even, but something underneath it was not. "Long before you ever said it aloud, I had already decided I was too old, too burdened with sisters and debts, too plain a prospect to be anyone's bride. And I had built an entire life around not needing anyone to disagree with that assessment, because needing it disproven would have meant admitting I still wanted it disproven at all." She looked at him. "When you said it at that ball, you didn't wound me, Your Grace. You confirmed something I'd already convinced myself of. That is what frightened me the night of your mother's ball. Not that you'd reduced me to a sum, but that I recognized the habit, because it's mine as well." "You are not a sum, Eleanor." Her name, unadorned, with no title attached to it. She watched it land on her, the way his confession had landed on him, too honest to deflect. Julian. It was the first time she had used his given name aloud to him, and something in her voice broke slightly around it, not with weakness, but with the particular vulnerability of a person setting down a weight they have been carrying so long they've forgotten its size. "I don't know what to do with a man who is careless in a ballroom and honest in an empty park 3 mornings running." "Then let me be honest somewhere a little less exposed," he said, glancing toward the stand of plane trees where a low hedge made a kind of green alcove half screened from the path. "Walk with me there a moment." She went, and in the green half-light, half-shielded by hedge and leaf, he said, "I have been in love with you since the night you corrected a stranger's ledger out of habit rather than vanity, and I am done pretending otherwise to either of us." She looked at him for a long moment, the same look she gave a column that wouldn't balance, searching for the error. This time, she found none. He kissed her there, in the morning quiet, screened from the open path, though not from the morning itself, and she did not pull away, did not glance toward the gap in the leaves, only lifted her hand to the lapel of his coat, as though to confirm he was real, and let the kiss answer what neither of them had quite managed in words. When it ended, neither moved very far. "We have just done something extremely unwise," Eleanor said, slightly breathless, "for two people who pride themselves on caution." "Yes," he agreed. "I find I don't regret it. Nor do I." He took her hand properly, the way he should have asked to, in the first place. "Eleanor, I am not going to ask you to marry me today, behind a hedge, having just kissed you without permission, and several months too late to call it sensible. You deserve a proper asking. But I needed you to know, before anything else was said between us, that this was never about a column that balanced. It was always simply you." She laughed, an unsteady, astonished sound, nothing like the composed precision she usually allowed herself. "Then you had better come and ask properly," she said, "before my aunt deduces what's happened from my face alone and tells the entire season before you've had the chance." He came the following afternoon, not to the front parlor, but asked instead, through Henrietta, whether Miss Whitfield might receive him in her father's old study, the small back room where the real accounts were kept, where Eleanor did the work no one in society ever saw. She found this request, when Henrietta relayed it with poorly concealed excitement, more disarming than any bouquet could have been. He arrived carrying, instead of flowers, a leather portfolio considerably larger than her own modest ledger, and set it on the desk between them without ceremony. "These are the Aldemir accounts," he said, "the real ones, not the version I've let London believe, solvent, merely cautious, but the actual state of the estate, the east wall, the tenant arrears, what my father left undone for 30 years because discussing money with the people who worked his land struck him as beneath a duke's dignity." He opened the portfolio and turned it toward her. "I want you to look at this before anything else is said between us, not because I require your approval of the figures, because I find I cannot ask you to share a house with me while keeping its true condition hidden from you the way I've kept it hidden from everyone else for 3 years. Eleanor drew the portfolio closer and began, without asking permission, to read. The deferred repairs, the rents uncollected out of a misplaced sense of gentility that had cost the estate considerably more than honesty would have. She read for several minutes in complete silence, and Julian, watching her, found he had never in his life waited so anxiously on anyone's opinion of a balance sheet. "Your steward has been carrying the east wall repair forward for 2 years, without revising the estimate," she said finally. "Materials have risen since then. It will cost considerably more now than it would have if you'd done it the first year you noticed. I'm aware. And Hartfield's cottages, if you repaired them even partially before autumn, his arrears would resolve themselves within the year. The man cannot pay rent on a roof that lets in weather. You're holding the debt as a problem when it's actually a symptom." "That," he said, with the faint, helpless wonder of a man watching a thing confirm itself exactly as he'd hoped, "is precisely what I thought, and precisely what no one in my circle has had the nerve to tell me plainly, because they are all too busy being delicate about my father's mistakes to mention that I am compounding them. I'm not being delicate, Your Grace." "No," he said quietly. "You never have been. It's the thing I love best about you." He took the portfolio gently from her hands, set it aside, and reached instead for both of hers. "Eleanor Whitfield, I am not a wealthy man, whatever the title suggests. I am, in fact, considerably poorer than half the men your aunt would consider a sensible match, and I'm asking you to marry a debt-laden estate and a duke who spent a humiliating fortnight convincing himself that wanting you required a practical excuse. He looked at her steadily. I have none to offer now. Only that I want you. Your judgment, your honesty, your habit of correcting other people's arithmetic without being asked. Beside me for the rest of my life, regardless of what the columns say. Will you have me? The ledger sat open between them still. Her father's old habit and his father's old failure laid side by side on the same desk. Eleanor found that this, of every moment she had once privately imagined and then carefully stopped imagining, was the one that actually undid her. Not a grand declaration in a ballroom, but a man handing her his true accounts and asking for her opinion of them before he asked for her hand. Yes, she said, though I should warn you, I intend to revise that east wall estimate myself before the week is out, and I shall expect to be consulted on every repair thereafter. I would expect nothing less. Outside the door, where Henrietta had been listening, with an enthusiasm she made absolutely no effort to disguise, a small triumphant sound escaped, which brought Lady Constance hurrying from the next room, demanding to know what, precisely, had happened. Years later, autumn settling gold and early over the Aldermere fields, two children's voices carrying from the garden, where Margaret was losing an argument with young Thomas about whether a particular bird was a thrush or merely a very ambitious sparrow, Julian found his wife at the estate desk. The small, worn ledger she had carried for 18 months sat retired on a shelf, its work long finished. On the desk before her now lay the household book they had begun together on their wedding day, combined accounts, his hand and hers in alternating entries, a record of a single shared life rather than two careful, separate survivals. Beside it, a half-finished letter to their daughter, away at her grandmother's for the fortnight, and a child's drawing of what appeared, with some generosity of interpretation, to be the east wall, standing solid now, repaired, letting in neither rain nor cold, signed with a confident, uneven Thomas along the bottom margin. She's doing sums again, Julian said, leaning in the doorway. I'm always doing sums, Your Grace. It's the one habit marriage hasn't cured. I find I don't want it cured. He crossed the room, leaned against the edge of the desk beside her, and looked at Thomas's drawing with the seriousness a child's artwork deserved. He's given the wall rather more bricks than it actually has, I think. He's an optimist. He gets it from neither of us, which I find encouraging. She set down her pen and looked up at him. Do you know, she said, I once told a man he had called me far too old to be anyone's bride. I recall the occasion vividly. You did not, in fact, say that. I said it, and got your age wrong in the process, which you have reminded me of on no fewer than a dozen occasions since. I was speaking generally, Your Grace. Allow a woman her revisions. He took her hand, ledger and pen and all, and pressed a kiss to her knuckles with the unhurried tenderness of a man no longer performing love for an audience, but simply living inside it. You were never too old to be anyone's bride, Eleanor. You were only ever waiting for someone with the sense to notice you had already become something better. He looked at her, a partner, the only account I have kept these past years that has ever truly balanced. That, Eleanor said, is the truest thing you have ever said to me. Outside, the east wall stood in the last of the autumn light, the fields green and mended, every column at last accounted for.